So we are live for the App Architecture Q&A number 9. I'm alone in the studio again, but Chris is with us.
Hello. Yeah, I'm going to be here from home for a little while because, well, one of the reasons why we had the deadline for the book in April is because I was going to become a dad somewhere in the middle of April. But as things go, plans change, and the baby decided to come a few weeks early. So that's why I'm now home and dialing into the studio.
Awesome. And we also got Matt with us again from Australia.
Yep. Hi. All of my kids came years ago, so things haven't changed for me.
So let's get right into it here. So the first question is just an easy meta question from Luke. He asks if the videos will be available separately if you just got the ebook. Chris, what will we do there?
Yeah, well, we haven't decided on the technical implementation for that, but I'm pretty sure we will provide a way to upgrade to the Book Plus videos. I don't think we will sell the videos separately because they don't make much sense without the book, I think. I mean, they do, but I think it makes a lot more sense with the book. So I don't know if it's such a good idea to sell them separately. But for those who bought the book without videos, we'll find a way to do an upgrade.
Yeah, so we'll see how we do that. But quite a few people have asked that, so we'll look into this and see how we can make it happen. Then the second question is from, I don't know exactly how to pronounce this name, Germund, something like that. And he asks, so in the Elm architecture, what is an equivalent of a segue in there? Chris, you've written most of the code in the Elm architecture framework.
Yeah, so it depends a bit on what you're asking exactly. You don't push a view controller, and likewise, you don't instantiate a segue directly in the Elm architecture. So instead, what you would do if you want to present another view controller, or if you want to do the equivalent of pushing a view controller, you would change your view state, and then automatically all the new views will get rendered. So your view rendering function needs to accommodate for this changed state. So let's say you have an array of folders in your view state, then you would add a new folder to that array, and that would render a new view controller, and then the framework would pick it up and see, hey, there's a new view controller that should be on screen, I'll push it for you. That's how you would sort of trigger a transition. And I don't know, Matt, if you have any ideas about animations for these kinds of transitions?
I mean, the animations rely on the framework detecting the change because, of course, the state from the app's perspective, or the view of state from the app's perspective, is that state does not change. You always get a single state and you pretend as though there was never a history. So it's up to the framework, the driver in our implementation, to detect that change. And when it detects a change, it can apply whatever transition it wants, but it needs to be a change that's baked into the framework. So, you can do a diff on a table and perform row animations, but you have to do the diff yourself. Same way, you can do a diff on the view states, but you have to bake into the driver then how you want to transition between those two states. So once you can detect the transition, then it's just a matter of encoding it. It's a lot harder if you want to talk about custom animations. I don't think we have a good story for that because, again, the premise is you're presenting it as though the state doesn't change. It's just, here is a state and present it. So,
yeah, I think the thing with these really custom animations is we always provide the entire state, and we don't know what changed. We can only record this after the fact, and you might be able to put this in a property and a state somewhere, saying, hey, this just changed, but that's also a little bit tricky.
I mean, you could definitely have a view, and part of the view's definition is that it wants fade in, fade out as its animation, or it wants page curl animations when it appears and disappears. And that could be the nature of that view. You wouldn't be able to customize it for a specific transition, but you could say this view wants zoom in, zoom out transitions, and that can be just the nature of it. You could add it as a field somewhere. You specify the appearance style. But beyond that, I mean, that's really what you have to do. You have to describe it as an inherent property of the view for all time.
Yeah, I have the feeling it's very possible to encode animations somehow, but I don't know exactly how to do it in the same way as, well, to get the same result as what you can do if you ikit. I think that's to be explored, and there are many ideas in that direction, but someone needs to sit down and build it for a few weeks at least and see what happens.
Yeah. So just on a related note, because that's always the case with everything in the Elm architecture examples, a lot of work is done behind the scenes in the Elm architecture framework. And in the book videos, we will actually have a nice video about building a simple version of this Elm architecture framework. And I think this works much better than showing how all these parts hang together in the book, because there we can just build a simple version of this from scratch in one session. So I think this will also be helpful to understand what's happening behind the scenes there. So then we have a question, or maybe a few questions from Alex. And Alex asks about MVVMC, and specifically the coordinators in MVVMC. And I will try to maybe summarize his first 2 points here. He says, well, in our implementation, we've created delegate protocols for the different view controllers, which the coordinator then conforms to, so that we can communicate from the view controller to the coordinator. And he says, well, if you have lots of these view controllers that need to communicate with the coordinator, then your coordinator will end up conforming to tons of protocols. And what's up with that? And also, if you would have multiple view controllers, for example, that all have to tell the coordinator about a did select on a table view, then how do you differentiate that? And how do you differentiate where this event is coming from, and how do you handle this in this situation? Who of you wants to start?
I can say a little bit about protocols. Well, yeah, if you have multiple conformances, it can be very easy to handle that, or it can be tricky. It depends a bit on what your protocol looks like. If in a delegate method, if you need to recover a lot of state, let's say you have, I don't know, you have a recording, and then in a delegate method, you only get your table view and an index path, and then you need to find a recording for that index path and do something else. So if you get a lot of these recovery paths, then sometimes it can be much easier to use a callback. And if you use a callback, then you can just capture these things in a closure. The disadvantage of using closures instead of delegates is that it's a little bit trickier to get, or well, not trickier, you need to be more precise if you want to get the memory management right, because it's way easier to get reference cycles, and with a delegate, it's usually weak, and at least that reference cycle is solved. But I guess there are some other aspects. Matt, you probably have some opinions on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways of handling a coordinator. The approach we've taken is the simplest, and I think works the best in small apps. But as it gets bigger and more sophisticated, there are a number of different ways you can represent the coordinator. So you can have actions that go via your view model, pick up view state, and are then observed by the view controller again, which pushes it up to the coordinator. Or you can have actions that go up into your view model And you could even have the coordinator directly observe an observable on the view model. Again, though, that can get a little bit tricky with reference cycles, so you do have to be careful about the ownership pattern going on there. And then there's always another approach which helps if your coordinator has a lot of state, which is that you give up on the coordinator being a control element, and you instead make it a representation of the navigation structure of your app, a stateful representation of the navigation structure. And then you have each controller that needs to push and pop things observing that structure and handling it. So it works a little bit more like view state than an actual controller. So I think depending on your app and how much you're representing, I think the approach we have works best for simple apps. I think pushing things into the view model, combining it with that view model state, and then re-observing it back in the control layer and in through the coordinator works best for mid-sized apps. And then for very big apps where you're representing, perhaps you have complex session data, perhaps you have multiple users or other aspects to keep track of in your app, you can maintain this as a sort of navigation state domain within your app. But then you need to have all of your different view controllers observing the part of that domain that is relevant to them and maintaining the structure in a more decentralized way than the coordinator normally allows. Alternately, you can actually have the coordinator observe your navigation state and apply it that way. So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot of different ways of doing it, and you have to look at what's important for your app and how much structure you have.
Yeah, so we are not really, we are not suggesting that this approach we have taken in the sample app is the one way to go. There are many ways of scaling this up. And I would also say a first approach of scaling it up, for example, if you have to differentiate did select calls from many different table view controllers, or maybe even you want to differentiate the did select from different view controllers of the same type, then you could first look at how the Coco framework solve this. So you could create different delegate methods. You could have, in our sample app, you could have something like folder view controller did select. And then as the first parameter, you pass in the view controller. You can distinguish based on that. And then for a different view controller, you might have something like user view controller did select. And you can already distinguish based on that. And then you can branch out into more elaborate approaches if you need more than that, as Matt outlined.
I have two side notes still to add to this. So one thing to keep in mind is, in the end, everything you can do with a delegate, you can also do with a closure-based approach, and the other way around. At least technically, some things you can do automatically with, for example, delegate, like the reference, the weak references. But you can also do that with closures. The other thing is, one approach I've also taken before is I once wanted to have closures because that made my code much easier in the controller object, but I had to conform to one delegate multiple times. Let's say your coordinator is this object that needs to conform to multiple folder view controller delegates. Instead of the coordinator being the delegate, you can also create a wrapper object, which is just a delegate, and it vents your closures. So you can basically wrap a delegate-based API into a closure-based API, and then you would store those objects. It doesn't really help maybe with the question, but it's another way to do it.
Yeah, so these are all the questions we have for this week. Maybe we can end up with a quick update of what's going on. So we have spent quite some time in the last 2 weeks to get the videos ready for the book. They are not released yet, but we have recorded a big part of them. And Matt visited us in Berlin for this also. We recorded a bunch of videos with him here. And now we are working on adding some little sections here, missing sections here and there in the existing chapters. And we are also working on finishing up one last additional chapter that will be about how to integrate networking and what kind of challenges do arise from this and how can you do that. So that's basically what we are working on currently. We will have still a few more Q&As before the book will be finalized. So if you have any more questions, then tweet them to us, send us emails, file issues, and then we'll see you again next week for the Q&A. Bye, Chris. Bye, Matt.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Florian.